Did you know that just because government says something is legal, it doesn't mean that it's moral? You know, I was shocked when I learned in going to school to be a law enforcement officer of this reality. Of course, you know, right? Or we think we know. Well, find out for yourself, for it has eternal consequences for us to be able to understand this thing. Check it out. Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFN TV. I am so excited and honored that you've joined us today on VFN TV. I'm going to go right to it. Today we're going to begin to talk about, where we are in the state of this land and what does law mean? You know, we're a land of laws, as President George Washington said, and that we have legislator branches, we have lawyers, we have courts, we have all these different systems, but that's in the land. But what do we have with God? I mean, God has a law as well. We call those laws really morality. And so we want to talk about that today. It's so important because I remember when I was going to school to learn how to do law enforcement, when I was in law enforcement, I remember my instructor showing this to me, and I was so surprised. I mean, I just assumed these two things. I don't know what I assumed, but it just really helped me understand how things should be. And so we're just going to go right to it. Take a look at this. I mean, you think about the law. When you think about the law, take a look at this next slide here. The law, for example, the laws of men, their laws our state legislature, our national legislatures decide to establish. One of the main purposes of the legislative branch in our government system is to be able to establish laws. George Washington, as I said, President George Washington talked about it. We're a land of laws. The whole thing that kind of keeps us in a place is the laws. The Constitution is a law. The Bill of Civil Rights is a law. And so when you think about law, this is what it means. A stop sign says stop, a green light says go, and it's very important that we're a land of laws. We have a ton of laws, as a matter of fact. But, and that's why we have lawyers and courts and that type of thing. But you think about morality now as Christians, we have God's law in our heart, and God expects us. So you're looking at morality here, and the morality is defined according to the dictionary of relating to or concerned with principles or rules of right conduct or the distinction between right and wrong, ethical, moral attitudes, founded on the fundamental principles of right conduct rather than one legalities, enactment, or custom, moral obligation. So when you think about the aspect of these two, you have the law of the land, and then you have morality. But when you think about those two different things, take a look at the slide. They're really not the same thing. This is important because so many people right now we're seeing some laws change and have seen for many years laws changed. And people are responding as if we can legalize morality. And if we could actually legalize morality, then there wouldn't have been a need for a new covenant, because God had all the laws that He'd given to Moses, but the laws just prove that inside of us in our sin nature that we could not walk this out. And so there was grace that came in, but in that there's still God's law, and that's called the moral law for us to follow. Still we struggle. I think about, Paul in Romans chapter 7 when he's writing to the church of Rome, he says, I got some good plans. I want to be able to follow this thing through, but there's something inside of me waging war against the law of my mind. When I want to go do good, in other words, when I want to follow the law, something inside me wants to violate it. So I'm totally dependent upon Jesus Christ to empower me to walk this thing out. But we still are supposed to walk it out. Even though we fail, we're supposed to walk it out. So they're not the same. So law and morality are not the same. That's important because sometimes people feel like when you see a new law passed or people are trying to push a law, they act like God left the universe and that everything's changed now, that we left God. No, it just means man made a law that's contrary to the moral laws of God. That's what that actually means. God didn't change, and by the way, He doesn't expect us to change. But sometimes, as you can see this next slide here, but sometimes they can be the same. Go to the next. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes you have a good law, a moral law, and of course morality, and they come together. And let's believe me, this has never been the case 100% of the time. Because when you think about it, some of the laws that have been passed over time, slavery was a law. It was legal in America to own slaves, to own human beings. And it was legal to say that they were not citizens of the United States. No, that was immoral for that to even exist. So that had nothing to do with morality. Go back to the previous slide. So you go back to the previous slide and go back one more. That the morality is that the African American in America is a human being created in the image and the likeness of God and has equal rights, as Dr. King said, under the law. And the immoral law was to say that he didn't or that she didn't. So that's called, it's called that there's a conflict that takes place right there. So let's just move back forward again. And so sometimes they overlap. For example, there could be, a law that says, on a day that you worship the Lord, maybe it's Sunday for you, and it says that the owner of the business has to make an effort to allow you to be able to get off of work so you can go work. In other words, if they had somebody that would work on that Sunday and they refused to give it to that person and made you do it, that would be, right or wrong. But the law says that they have to make an effort to let you do that, according to J. Sekulow. And so what happens is that thing intersects where that's a good law and it's a moral law. It kind of works together in the context of that. But also you had a situation back when you think about Sanger. She's the one that invented, sponsored the, eugenics and things of that nature, about literally, doing away with parts of the population that people thought that didn't deserve to live, that they were a burden on society. And they were passing laws, and they still, I believe there's even laws today on the books that talk about eugenics and these type of things. And that actually is a law, or was a law, but it's immoral to take someone's life because you think they're not smart enough or they don't contribute enough to society. Another situation is when you think about abortion. There is a law. Up to a certain point, you can actually, you can destroy your baby in your body. You can end the life of your baby, in your body. You can kill your baby. I mean, right now there's a law that says that. It's Roe versus Wade. It was held up since 1973, I believe. No, that's a law, but that's not a moral law. That's murder because God says, do not commit murder. So let's go to the next slide here. So in Proverbs 29:2, he says, the Word of God says this: when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. And that the reason why that is because all of a sudden, when the wicked are ruling, people that don't want to follow God's principles, they start creating laws that make it very difficult for people who want to live a life in a way. I mean, obviously we're not perfect, and we cry out for God's leadership, but we have a desire to follow God through the power of what we get through His finished work on the cross of Christ by His Spirit. But when the laws are contrary to that, it makes it very difficult. So what happens is the people groan because it's like, oh, I got this law that says, I don't want my daughter to abort her child, but the laws are working against me because I raised her not to abort her child, but she goes out to the land and the land says it's legal for you to destroy your child in your body. And so the parents groan inside because the laws are against the laws of God, the morality in the context of that. And of course, later on, you find quite often the very young lady or lady that did in the life of her child, she begins to groan, kind of, suffering in the future for what she had done in her past. And God's got grace for that. But I'm just talking about how these things, are different and how they're not the same. It's so important. Let's go to the next slide. So it's very important that this is why people groan. You have the law and you have morality. Let's go to the next one. As Christians, we're called to live moral lives, to strive, to attempt to do what's right, even though, like Paul said in Romans chapter 7, this is the way I say it, I fell less than I used to, but the grace of God I'm able to walk. But I have a desire to walk right before God, by His grace and in view of His mercy. And so in that creates a problem because we're called to live moral lives. And so when they don't come together at all, there's no touching of the two, that's when that difficult happens. So look at this next one. So we can only do this walk by grace, but this whole thing, when they're totally separate, when the morality and law of the land separate, this is what feeds in to a lot of people who believe law is moral or law is morality, and all of a sudden they think, if I could just change the law, I'll no longer have to listen to my parents anymore. If I could just change the law, we won't need school anymore. If I could just change the law, I can kill my kid in my womb. If I could just change the law, I could end my parents' life at an early age. If I could just end the law, this is what they think, if I could end the law, but change the law, then I could say, that this particular race of people is not as good as my race, that type of thing. And the thing is, it's like that's law. That is not morality. So many people historically, based on this reality and this truth, have violated God's moral law while they lived by the laws of the land, and they died in their last breath thinking they were morally correct before God. But the reality was they were legally correct before man, but immoral towards God for how they treated someone or what they did, because they didn't know they needed to repent from that. So you look at this next particular slide here. This helps us out, and this is Dr. King's word. This is so important because these things are going to collide. You're going to have morality, moral law, and you're going to have land of the man's law collide. But Dr. King said very specifically, he said, hate does not drive out hate. Only love can do that. And he said, darkness does not drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And that's so important. I think about this particular Meet the Press where Dr. King was speaking. He was talking about an unjust law is no law at all. You think about that. An immoral law is no law at all. As a matter of fact, let's take a look right now. I believe it was in 1963 when he was having this meeting on Meet the Press. Take a look.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who is in San Francisco. On our panel of reporters in Washington, D.C., you have just met Lawrence Spivak. Our other reporters today are Tom Wickert of the New York Times, James J. Kilpatrick of the Richmond News Leader, and John Chancellor of NBC News. We'll continue the questions now with Mr. Wickert.
Dr. King, you said a moment ago that Alabama was a state that gives respectability to the resistance and defiance of the law. And you listed an observance of the law by local agencies in the South as one of the cardinal aims that you were seeking. Yet on March the 9th, you led the second march on Montgomery in violation of a federal injunction not to march. You said that order was unjust, and John Lewis, one of your colleagues, said that the Negroes had a constitutional right to march, injunction or no injunction. Now, was that in keeping with the spirit of nonviolence and the restraint that has always characterized your movement, and could you explain your reasoning in defying the court order that day?
Well, let me say two things to that, Mr. Wicker. First, I did not consider myself defying a court order that particular day. I consulted with my attorneys before the march, and they stated that they felt that it was an invalid order, and that it would not be, that I would not be in contempt of court, violating the court order if I led the march to the point of having a moral confrontation with the state troopers at the point where the people were brutalized on Sunday. So I still don't consider that breaking a court order or breaking what I consider an unjust law. On the other hand, I must be honest enough to say that I do feel that there are two types of laws. One is a just law and one is an unjust law. I think we all have moral obligations to obey just laws. On the other hand, I think we have moral obligations to disobey unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. I think the distinction here is that when one breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, he must do it openly, he must do it cheerfully, he must do it lovingly, he must do it civilly, not uncivilly, and he must do it with a willingness to accept the penalty. And any man who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of the law, is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law.
Well, I can sympathize with a good deal of that, but it seems to me you get into a very difficult point here at which one man's conscience is set, in fact, above the conscience of society, which has invoked the law. How are we to enforce law when a doctrine is preached that one man's conscience may tell him that the law is unjust when other men's conscience don't tell them that?
And I think you enforce it, and I think you deal with it by not allowing anarchy to develop. I do not believe in defying the law, as many of the segregationists do. I do not believe in evading the law, as many of the segregationists do. The fact is that most of the segregationists and racists that I see are not willing to suffer enough for their beliefs in segregation, and they are not willing to go to jail. I think the chief norm for guiding the situation is the willingness to accept the penalty. And I don't think any society can call an individual irresponsible who breaks the law and willingly accepts the penalty if conscience tells him that that law is unjust. And I think that this is a long tradition in our society. It's a long tradition in biblical history. Meshach and Abednego broke an unjust law, and they did it because they had to be true to a higher moral law. The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner. Academic freedom would not be a reality today if it had not been for Socrates, and if it had not been for Socrates' willingness to practice civil disobedience. And I would say that in our own history, there's nothing that expresses massive civil disobedience any more than the Boston Tea Party, and yet we give this to our young people and our students as a part of the great tradition of our nation. So I think we're in good company when we break unjust laws, and I think those who are willing to do it and accept the penalty are those who are part of the saving of the nation.
Think about that, for the saving of the nations. Dr. King was warning us. He says, this is how you save a nation, when you begin to have this moral confrontation. And so you're looking at, this would be an immoral confrontation, but when you think about, let's go to the next slide. So when you think about it, you know, when law, which is like the hammer of the law, is coming against morality, we, like Dr. King, would just say that's an unjust law, which is no law at all. And so you think about Proverbs 29:22, which we talked about. And after this break, we're going to be talking about, back up a little bit, back where we were. And right after this break, we're going to be talking about Matthew 5:1, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, because he talks to us specifically about how our behavior, how our attitude needs to be. As a matter of fact, God's not upset or concerned about this reality of the environment. Take a look at what Jesus told us right here. He told us this specific statement in Luke 10:2-3. He says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs amongst wolves. That's from Jesus. He's saying, listen, stand up for God. Stand up in a loving and a kind way. And there's nobody, I don't think, that's better for us to imitate than an American citizen, American Christian citizen, which I believe was an apostle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are talking about, law versus morality. And when you think about that in the context of, this is the big argument. It's always been the big argument. When you think about it, John, that men are trying to save themselves by the law and some sort of righteous law. And when you see the legal argument, it's like you always lose. And it's normally the people that are, trying to, a law that they like.
Of course, yes.
I call it the okra law, not Oprah, but the okra, like the vegetable thing or whatever it is. And, they like it. They like that particular law, and they just think, everybody should not like okra. Oysters, people shouldn't like oysters. They're not kosher and all that kind of stuff. And But that's their preference.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with sin, but it has nothing to do with God. And so this legal argument, when you think about this legal argument, that it's been around since the beginning of time. And it was proven out by God when you look, at us over a period of time since the Garden of Eden. We've had a few little issues, with the law. And right now, the one thing that one of the tools in Satan's chest, which was even written about by Saul Alinsky, is make them live up to their own rules. And the rule of God is grace. It's mercy and empowerment by his finished work on the cross that enables us to actually walk rightly before God. And any good that happens in our life, as Jesus says, it's God, it's not us. And that can be really confusing to people who try to create laws within their own nature to try to make things work. And normally they do in front of men, but they're crashing and burning when they're not in the eyes of men because they live their whole life about trying to live a self-righteous life. I mean, Jesus talked about it, about the Pharisees. He said, you're whitewashed tombs. On the outside, you look like you're right, but the inside, you're full of dead man's bones. You're constantly talking about the outside of the cup, not the inside of the cup. And God's talking about our hearts. And so we should never panic over anyone who is trying to make a law because our righteousness with God is not based off of the law. It's based off the cross of Christ and the grace of Christ. And that a law, no matter it was good or bad, I mean, you think about it, do not murder has been on the, books for a law for quite some time in America. And based on my years in law enforcement, even though there was a law, people still took people's lives.
Imagine that.
It's amazing how that works, And so creating a law, you cannot legislate morality. But it's really cool when you have a legal system that helps perpetuate those who desire to live the best they can a moral life before God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you have people right now in today's environment, they're pushing like crazy on legalism from a world's perspective. And like, if you just change this law, then I'll be right. And it's like, it has nothing to do with being right. I mean, even if the law said, be perfect and then it doesn't make you perfect because the law says it's perfect. It's just a law that just says be perfect. If any law at all, you could think of, there's thousands of them. They said you couldn't even stack them up. There's so many of them. But there's people right now that are trying to push laws, and there's a lot of folks that are panicking because of what does that mean to Christians? What does that mean to, the kingdom of God? Well, truly, it means absolutely nothing in the context of it. But it does mean this, it's not happening by accident. And it's not happening because God's going, hey, I want to hurt you or anything like that. We got to ask ourselves, is it happening because we said we were moral? We said that, we are one nation under God, but we live like we were immoral and we live. Now I'm not talking to anybody that's not Christian here. I'm just talking about people who profess to be Christ followers that we've sinned against God, not the people in the world, not the people that's involved in the world's view of the legal system. There's people right now that are trying to push laws, and there's a lot of folks that are panicking because of what does that mean to Christians? What does that mean to, the kingdom of God? Well, truly, it means absolutely nothing in the context of it. But it does mean this, it's not happening by accident. And it's not happening because God's going, hey, I want to hurt you or anything like that. We got to ask ourselves, is it happening because we said we were moral? We said that, we are one nation under God, but we live like we were immoral and we live. Now I'm not talking to anybody that's not Christian here. I'm just talking about people who profess to be Christ followers that we've sinned against God, not the people in the world, not the people that's involved in the world's view of the legal system. Could God just be getting our attention because we were turning to laws to say, and we were convinced that because if you can make this a law, that you're right. But remember this, that there was a day that believe it or not, and it's so just confounding to me, that people actually believed, and they said, and they voted for it in Washington, D.C., that one man was not valuable, his wife wasn't valuable, and his children weren't valuable, and they couldn't be American citizens. As a matter of fact, you could actually own those people. That was a law that was accepted in the land of America. It was constitutionally, it was a law. And a lot of people, and the crazy stuff, if you have not seen 12 Years a Slave, which I would say see it on Clear Play, I just no, you're enslaving these folks because it's legally right. But they were standing there, John, with a Bible in their hand in the backyard, mind you, not in the house.
Right.
While they were sitting on logs and stuff like this, African Americans were enslaved by the slave owner at the plantation while they're preaching the gospel, talking about what's in the scriptures.
Right.
And even using scriptures on the, it was just I'm like, no, And it's now, obviously today, that people can go, that's just crazy. Why would anybody? But you have to understand, they thought at that time that it wasn't crazy. The people walked and they went to church every day, and it didn't wink their eye, didn't blink their eye, because it wasn't everybody that was doing it, owning people, and those that were owning people, everybody wasn't abusing people, but the very fact that you could say a human being is created in the image and likeness of God, and that our Constitution says that all of our rights come from God, and that you could live contrary to that. I mean, you think about that, but you have to understand, in the mind of the heart of this nation, who took over the cotton market of the world and sent all the cotton to Europe so they could make textiles for the world, mind you. And that came because of free labor, slave labor. That's called legal then, yes, but it was not moral. It never was moral. Those two things didn't even connect. They didn't even overlap. And how crazy that is now to us. How crazy that is to us now. And hopefully it's crazy to you. If it's not, you'll find out the judgment seat of Christ is crazy.
That's right.
Because it's immoral. There's some things that people are trying to do today. Things that are trying to say, let's make a law for this. Let's make a law for that. 1973, let's make a law for Roe versus Wade. Let's make a law that says, you know what? You can kill your baby in your womb. You can end the life of your baby in the womb. And just like the days when slavery was legal, it was legal, but immoral. That today people look at ending the life of a child in the mother's womb as legal, and they think it's immoral because it's legal, but it's not. We're going to face God one day, and he's going to ask us, and you're going to say, well, it was legal. I finally got my legislator to put in a bill. We passed it. We got Roe versus Wade, even though the woman that we used to get the particular bill passed never aborted her child and didn't want anything to do with a particular thing, but we changed the law, God. So I just want to let you know that there's a law in America that says that we can end the life of our child. You have to understand, you're not saved by the law, because a man who actually lives by the law dies by the law. If you broke one law, you broke them all. You're not righteous by the law. And you can't form Jesus to some other Jesus and all of a sudden think that Jesus is going to rubber stamp your form of God. I mean, he's not. You just created another God. And so the dilemma is, as crazy as slavery seems today, and when people just really? I don't think so. That's not going to happen on my watch. There's going to be a day. There's going to be a day that people are going to look back and they're going to say, you know what? I cannot believe there was a day that somebody would actually kill their child in their body.
Wow.
I mean, today it's like the mentality of slavery where people actually thought that was right. Well, today, guess what? Do you think abortion is right? Do you think these immoral laws that are being passed make things change? Or you think, you know what? I'm going to step outside of this world system, no matter what happens in this world, And the law drives me to God because I fail and I try to do things legalistically and try to make some law to make myself right. Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 7. He says, when I go to do good, I can't do it because there's something inside of me that breaks the law. And so I turn to God, and God fulfills the righteous requirements of the law inside his Son. That's what Jesus is about. And so this fueling of legalism and laws, if we got to change the laws, it's going to escalate and magnify our sin. It's going to cause us to look utterly sinful. But guess what? That's not a negative thing. It's just a real thing that makes us go, you're right. You're right. Outside of Jesus Christ, there's no way I could do this. There's no way I could do this. But we have this going for us in regards to being America in this fledgling nation, is the fact that we had an American citizen who had great suffrage in his life, and he was an African American, but he also was a Christian. And his daughter, Bernice King, who heads the King Center now, she says a lot of people say that, oh, my dad was, in the was called to do the civil rights movement. And she says, no, he was called for a spiritual movement, and he was assigned to the civil rights. Civil rights are for all of us. And we have to stand up. He stood up because it was immoral and unjust, the things that were happening to the African American citizens and human beings and the citizens in America. And it's time that the church, we have to stand up and just say, even if there's some sort of conflict in coming together, that even if I suffer, and we're going to talk about that when we get back from this break, because there is going to be conflict. Jesus Christ is a wedge issue, but it wedges us, separates us from our sin, but it also separates us from those who don't want anything to do with God. I mean, you think about that. A wedge issue is where people who get along, there's something that comes in between them. Every time you bring Jesus up as the Son of God and the one that paid the price and that no man's righteous by the law, and we have to have God, and we have to have his moral law in our hearts and seek it, it's a wedge issue. So you got to get over it, and you got to find out, God, how do I walk as an American Christian? How do I remain civil as a civil Christian in a civil nation called America? I think Dr. King kind of set an example. You're looking at this particular scripture that's over my left shoulder, I think. Is it there? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about that, he already knew it's going to be a rough environment. This thing of saying that it's not going to be a rough environment, but we're not supposed to, fight evil with evil. I mean, like Dr. King said, that, hate doesn't drive out hate, only love does that. And, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Mm-hmm. Light and love. That's something that we're going to, and you may be struggling with this, that you've been religious your whole life, but you're thinking, how do I do that? It's because you don't know God yet. Because it's based on that. It's totally, your walk with God is based on that. And you want to know how to love. Believe me, I think about Bob Jones when he actually had he died, his spirit went to go be with God. And you had two particular lines. One line was going, a real big line, and it was basically, not going to heaven. Mm-hmm. And he had a short line right there. And when he got there, John, he said, the question they asked Bob was, did you learn to love? Did you learn to love? And Bob's, I think he's going like, can you get some more time or something? I don't know what it was. And so anyway, they sent him back, and, Bob was just known for his love. And we got some segments about him on the VFN Torch. You got to be able to see him. But Jesus told us very specifically. He sat us down. Think about this. God, the creator of the universe, sat us down, mankind, and he said, let me explain something to you. We call it the Beatitudes. We call it Sermon on the Mount. But understand, the creator of the universe, God, sat down and he talked to us. And this is what we need to live our life by. And believe me, we need lots of grace and mercy to do it. But this should be our battle cry as Christians. This is what he said. He said, you want to be blessed? You want to be blessed? This is what he said. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I'm not going to be poor. And it's like, well, brother, you got to make up your mind. Whatever, right? Just stay loyal to the Lamb.
That's it.
Then he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they'll be comforted. That's another way to be blessed. Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't want to mourn. I don't want difficult things in my life. I don't want to stand up for righteousness. I want to hide in my luxurious Discovery Channel house with the new tile walls. And I don't want to come out and stand up for the little children being killed in the Middle East. I don't want to stand up. People won't like me. They'll throw rocks at me. They'll be like wolves. And that's what he said. I'm sending you out like lambs amongst wolves. You know, he says, be gentle as a dove, but wise as a serpent. He said, when they arrest you, don't worry about what you're going to say. When they arrest you.
Always got me.
When they arrest you. And so Dr. King was going, listen, if you actually, go and stand up for an unjust law and you break an unjust law, that's not really breaking a law, but you got to be willing to suffer the penalty of that law. I mean, a lot of people are like willing to go, that ain't right. You ain't taking me to jail. And the thing is that you got to read his letter that he wrote from the Birmingham prison. We don't have a lot of time to get into that. Hopefully our next program that we will. But it's just really just, we're inextricably tied together, and somehow my success is tied to your success, and that, if I'm not successful, you won't be successful, and if you're not successful, I won't be successful. That's God. That's the one another's that he said. This is how God's designed things. And then he goes on, he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Do you want to inherit the earth? Be meek. Meek is not wimpish. Meek is like a horse under control. A meek horse is like a strong horse, but its rider can just whisper, just gently tug on its reins, and it turns to the right, it turns to the left, it carries the load. The Holy Spirit speaks to you, and you respond. It's strength under control. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, not demand it, not call out for righteous laws. Be righteous. Walk out and just say, I'm going to live my life. That's just more difficult enough. Say, Lord, I want my life to be a light. I want to live in such a way that your name is glorified. And he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for that, for righteousness, for they'll be filled. So when we start calling out to God for that kind of life, guess what? God's going to respond and enable us and fill us. Then he says, blessed are the merciful. I mean, merciful is such a rare commodity. When people see it, they start throwing money at it and screaming and hollering, and it goes viral on the internet, But we're all, as Christians, we're supposed to be merciful people. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Do you want mercy? We've got to learn how to be merciful. And he said, blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Think about that humble spirit. We need to have a humble spirit. And humble doesn't mean doormat. It means total dependency on God and respect for folks. You respect folks, different genders, different races, different nations, whatever. I mean, you just love. They're creating the image and the likeness of God. I mean, you just respect people. Then he says, blessed are the peacemakers, not the rowdy people. Isn't it interesting how Dr. King had people to sign the 10 commitments to be able to walk with him? He was committed to peacemaking, moral confrontation against unjust laws, which was no law at all. He was willing to pay the penalty, but it was unjust. So he knew no matter what before God that he stood, and he said very specifically, and I've said this since day one in the launch, almost 3 years ago with VFN TV. Yes, this is like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is like a march to the furnace, but we have to make up our mind. Even if everybody bows down to Nebuchadnezzar's gods, that's them. But as for you and your house, or just you alone, maybe your house won't even stand. You can say, you know what, God, I'm not going to do this by your power and by your grace. I just can't do it, even if it ends everything, even if what I hold precious to me is taken from me. And by the way, your reward is great in heaven when you take that kind of stand. I can imagine what Dr. King's reward is like in heaven. But he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So there's going to be a lot of rebel rousing. There's going to be a lot of uprisings. There's going to be a lot of things that God's shown us prophetically that's going to be happening. But you should be different. As a Christian, that shouldn't be you. We have a whole segment inside the VFN Torch at VFNTV.com called Civil Christianity in a Civil Land. And we can learn so many lessons from Dr. King and those that walked, as you see, understand, because he was an American, he was a Christian, and he was somebody who was suffering from unjust laws. You put those three things together, a Chinese man can't do that, a Spanish man can't do that, a Mexican man can't do that, but an American Christian man can do that, who suffered injustice. And he set an example for us. A lot of people took his narrative and they co-opted it, but his daughter, who just recently said, and we'll have it probably for our next program, she said that was not right. Bernice King. She heads the King Center. She's the CEO of the King Center. I mean, you can find out more about that at the VFN Torch. Go to VFN Torch there and go down to Civil Christianity and a Civil Land. And finally, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now listen, it's not blessed are those who are self-righteous. It's not blessed are those who don't eat okra because they don't like okra. They just don't like that particular sin. I mean, think about it. What do you think what's happening in today's land? You have people that preach righteousness. You have people that say, you know what? You know, you cannot commit this sexual sin. But you know what? Every single night they go home and they watch that sexual sin on their television. They watch it on their computers. They watch it on their media. They say you cannot curse God, but yet they go watch media and listen to people curse God. They buy the media that says it damns God.
Right.
You know, God's going, enough. You know, we need help here. We need help. Is that if that's going on, we've fooled ourselves in thinking, you know, I love this, John. You know, somebody says, you know, I was just talking to somebody about you the other day. Yeah, he says, man, they was dogging you out. And almost everybody goes, what was going on? They was cursing your name. Why? They have no right to do that. And they get all in a tizzy.
Yeah.
And, you know, it wasn't happening. But when it comes to God's name, when it comes to standing up for God, people, it's like, oh, they only just cursed his name 6 times. Unlike the other times they cursed him 10 times.
Right.
And it's like, do you really love your wife if you allow people to curse her? Do you really love God if you allow, I mean, if you're okay with that?
Right.
I'm not talking about changing everything. I'm talking about you personally.
You personally.
Are we okay with that? Are we okay with, you know, children being murdered in the womb? Are we okay with the persecution of the church, the beheading of Christians, Egyptian Christians in the shores of Tripoli in Libya? Do we just go about our daily business the way they did during the unjust laws of slavery in America? Or are we going to stand up as global citizens and saying, dear God, this is a Dietrich Bonhoeffer moment for us. You need to go back and watch the Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we're probably going to play that. You ready to hear that? We got to start standing up. And thank God, think about this, and I'll close with this. This German minister who wasn't even saved comes to America, to New York, to preach a little bit. And he didn't like the church and what was going on. And an African-American pastor from Alabama, John, took him to but he was in New York, took him over to a Harlem African-American church, or church that was led by an African-American pastor. And they preached the gospel to him, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer got saved. He got saved. This is during the time of Hitler's days. And he saw the oppression of the African-Americans in this country. And it was the beginning of the oppression of the Jews in his country, in Germany. And he realized, I got to go back. But he went back with African-American gospel music. He went back trying to change the church of his day. But listen, this is a Bonhoeffer moment. You're not going to change this legalistic monster. It's time for you to start walking righteously and seeking righteousness and crying out for God, because we need him. It's time for us to look at those that have gone before us in America, that stood for God, and begin to stand.
Law versus morality. What does that mean, and how do we as Christians, who live before God in view of His mercy and because of His grace, be empowered to do the best we can in walking out a life that most lines up, with what God is saying. It's like Paul said, the things I want to do, I don't do, but things I do that I hate. But then he goes, but Jesus Christ empowers me to do that. And it's like, well, nobody's perfect, but we can always say when you're walking with God, because of His grace, because of His goodness, I'm walking better than I was yesterday. And that's one thing we can do, because we're constantly growing in it. But we have this big argument or view or discussion across the land today about legalism and laws, and that if you change a law, all of a sudden it's not wrong anymore. If you end a law, all of a sudden it's not right anymore. And it's just, the reality is, laws come, laws go. But God's law is forever, and it's written on the hearts of man. It's called the moral law. And we talked about that. You gotta go back and see that. You can see it at vfntv.com. But there comes a day when you think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others that have stood, Billy Graham and Oral Roberts, and there's many more. I'm just going off the top of my head right here. George Washington, General George Washington, that we just stood up, and take a right stand at a very difficult time. It takes courage to be able to do that. When you think about courage, that, you can put courage into people. But it's an environment today that where is courage? And why are people being courageous? We see it in sports where people scream and holler and they want their team to be able to win, and it's like they leave with this big exhaustion going like, phew, man, they burned all this energy out. But when it comes to living their life for God and, fighting for their family and, standing up for God, and it's like, where's the courage in that? And I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You think about these guys. They were living in a day when Israel was up under an evil government that had laws that were contrary to God, and so their moral behavior was contrary to what the law said. But you know what? They just went ahead and went with what God said. They didn't give in to the law of the land when it was immoral or unjust, because any unjust law is not a law at all, as Dr. Martin Luther King so informed us, as the accuracy of God's law and even our Constitution, because that's what it says. And so when you think about that, we need, courage today. Not courage to be religious zealots, not courage to try to push some sort of conservative mindset, just courage to stand. Courage to say, I know that you don't like the way that I'm living my life. I know that some of my presence just causes conviction in your life or whatever, and you think you need to change me. I love you, and I'm not gonna push myself on you, but I got to stand for God because I love God. It takes courage to do that, and we're facing a day and time when you think about what's happening in the Middle East. You think what's happening and beginning to happen with businesses across the United States and ministries, that it's coming. It's like, are you going to please man? Are you going to please God? Are you going to please your customer base, your corporate? You see corporations that are just immediately saying, we're going to go left, we're going to go right, we're going to go straight, we're going to go forward. But it's all based on money. That's what people saying, we're going to take your money from you. But this is what the Lord calls us to do. He calls us to stand for Him. This is what He says. He says it in Matthew chapter 10. He says that if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. Think about that. In other words, the one that created the universe, that if we deny Him, He'll deny us before the Father, before God. But He says, if you'll confess me and acknowledge me before men, He said, I'll acknowledge you before my Father. I want you to take a look here. This is Bishop Harry Jackson speaking on a CBN interview about, this is kind of where we are, talking about we need courageous leadership. And then we're going to have also, Bernice King, the CEO of the King Center in Atlanta, how important these days are to begin to look at those who have stood for what's right, and God responded. Take a look.
Religious freedom laws in states like Indiana and Arkansas are creating a debate across the nation with differing opinions, like conservative talk show host Bill O'Reilly calling out Christian leaders, saying they aren't taking a stand. Joining me to give his insight on the matter is Christian leader Bishop Harry Jackson of Reconcile Church. Bishop Jackson, you're engaging the culture when it comes to this debate and other issues in America. In this case, would you say O'Reilly is correct?
I think that he is correct, but he called out the wrong people. He mentioned some names, such as Pat Robertson and other people, simply saying, hey, where are they now? But essentially, we have a church that is falling asleep. I believe that if you take a stand, sometimes there's a backlash. Years ago, when they were debating the gay marriage versus traditional marriage issue in Washington, D.C., I was living in the district at that time. I had death threats, people slipping notes under my door, people following me through the city. The police even had to have a special surveillance of the place that I was living. It was an awesome, pressure-filled time. I went on O'Reilly Factor at that point, and he told the nation that folks had leaked my physical, personal address all throughout the region. Well, that's one of the reasons why people don't speak up. There are three things the average pastor fears more than anything. Number one, that he is going to be made a spectacle of on social media or in various avenues electronically these days. Your career can be over and ended in just a matter of days if you're seen in the wrong light. So they've got that fear. Secondly, many times within our congregations, there are people that sit there, they want to be encouraged, they want the word, but they don't want to be mobilized to do a lot. And so it really puts you in a precarious situation. Some pastors have been fired because of all that. And then third and finally, I believe that we're living in a day in which we have to come together in unity, like the Reconciled Church movement that you talked about earlier, that if we collaborate, we work together, then it's hard to pick out one person in the front of the line and take them out. I may speak up today, you speak up tomorrow, Pat Robertson speaks out next week, and that would be very powerful. So regarding religious liberties, yes, there seemed to be a silence, but many times the media does not want to play or give space or airtime to some of the voices that God has raised up. And so we need to come together, collaborate, work together, pray hard, and I think our voices will be heard.
I'm hearing your experiences as you stood up and continue to stand up for Christian principles and matters of faith. In light of how detrimental those experiences have been, what keeps you going?
What a question to ask appropriately. I believe there's a courage that comes to us as we pray, as we seek the Lord. I cut my teeth on watching things like Christian television, like the 700 Club, looking at people like Pat Robertson, John Hagee, many others, and their example has energized and encouraged me. So I believe that what's kept me going is the hope that we're going to get a critical, radical mass of people who are going to move together, and we're going to show the winsome, loving character of Christ, but we're also going to declare the truth as we understand it from the scriptures. So I think for years we've been working at telling the truth, at being a conscience to the nation. I think, however, at this time, there needs to be more of us committed to collaborating and working together.
What do you think God's message is to his people, the church, through these times?
Well, I believe that there is a message we shared on the 700 Club called the crumbling shield, that is the message, that the shield is crumbling and God is saying to us, wake up, I want to move on your behalf, but I need a critical mass of Christians. As it was in the days of Abraham, as he cried out to God about Sodom and Gomorrah, the Lord would have spared the whole culture if he had a critical mass, just 10 righteous men. And I believe that God is looking for a number of righteous church leaders, businessmen, politicians, and members, priests and prophets who will speak up in his name.
And you are certainly one of those. Bishop Harry Jackson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you much, Efren.
That's so powerful. You think about the three things: reputation, I'm going to lose my job if I ask these Christians to actually do what I'm preaching to them, and the lack of unity. Those three things, we begin to stand up together in humility, in the love of God, asking God to move. These things can happen. We can begin to turn, the people, the soul of the nation. We're not trying to save a country. We're not trying to save a nation. We want to save the people in the nation, the soul of the nation. That was Bishop, right before the break, Bishop, Harry Jackson. And I thought it was pretty powerful, many things that he said. Mm-hmm. And but the three things I think that stand out, in addition to critical movement, critical mass, is he said, reputation. Mm-hmm. Why don't we do? I just was just recently hearing I would say young minister, but we're not young anymore. Mm-hmm. We really are in our minds. And so he was talking about, he was expecting his congregation to do something. So he's talking, what God says. Mm-hmm. And the number started going down. And he was talking about, basically preach this thing empty, and I think that's because we try to do what God's called us to do in the confinement of something. instead of the world.
Wow.
You know, it's difficult to speak to people that are not planning on doing what you ask, what God says to do. And if your job is to be the message or messenger to deliver that message to a people who are not going to listen, that causes for a lot of therapy and a lot of things like that. But then, you know, reputation, the world immediately is going to ridicule you. I mean, it's so weird how it works. I mean, you may have members of your own family when you start saying, you know, this is not the way God would want us to go. And all of a sudden, you always do this, and you self-righteous, and you, that's ridicule. And it's a typical process. And I wish I had those steps, but it says, you know, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. It's kind of the rules, something like that. And so many people give up and they just don't want to be ridiculed. And it's like, well, if you, listen, when you're walking and doing what God's telling you to do, you know, Jesus said, you know, even members of your own family will ridicule you. And, you know, he talks about that in Matthew chapter 10. He said, don't suppose I came to bring peace, but a sword. And to turn people that are not going to stand with him, they're going to be adversarial to you. And so ridicule, I think also, if you haven't gotten this book, you need to read the book, The Torch and the Sword, because this 12-year-old girl in this vision, it's a vision that, I mean, she just pushed past the ridicule. And one of the people in this vision that could not move past the ridicule was her very own mother. So she had to even leave her mother behind as she progressed forward. 12-year-old girl, and she faced the inevitable battle in God. I mean, this is just how it always is. And today, people feel like they're right if everybody loves them. But Jesus said that beware when everybody's okay with you, because this is how they treat false people that aren't real, the false prophets. And so the first thing he talked about was about reputation. You know, I mean, I guess go ahead and just throw it away if you know, just, you know.
Oh, that's right.
Like, brace yourself, because today, you can get reputation, whatever.
That's it.
I mean, it is rough, and it's going to be rough. And let everybody know, write your own narrative before it happens, that who you really are. I think about Steve Hill during the rounds of revival for years, and he just constantly said, you know, I was a thief, and I stole from you, and I did these things and these bad things and these things. And that's actually what encourages people to find out that we're sinners saved by grace. They want to know our testimony. And the thing is that outside of God, there's no difference in anybody. But when Jesus comes and saves us, it's Jesus that's the difference. It's not us and our righteous behavior. It's Jesus. And so let people know. And because the only good in us is God, and people need to know that. The second they start projecting, or you start saying that you're good, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because even Jesus said, who are you calling good? The only good in me, Jesus said, is the Father. And so when we get past that good thing and get into the God thing, then, you know, we can begin to move. And another thing that he said was, and we're going to have Bernice King up in just a moment, powerful CEO of the King Center, daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would know better, you know, and understanding how to stand up for what's right. And the second thing you talked about was mobilization, you know, and you have to mobilize. And
third thing.
Well, one of the things you talked about was the job. If you start losing your job as a minister, if you try to mobilize them and get them to activate and to do something. And, you know, what part of it don't you get that I'm not going to do something? And what I think about James chapter 1, verse 22. You know, read that right there real quick, like through 25. Think about this, about being doing versus hearing.
Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do.
So there's a way to be blessed, and it's about being a doer. And when we get back from the break in a moment, we're going to talk about the third thing, and that actually is the unity, coming together. And this is what he says. He says the place of the commanded blessing is when we do things together and do God's things together, not somebody's idea of things together. And but you have really like 4 different characteristics of people when you think about that. You know, if you're talking to people who aren't going to do it, you have, I guess you could say this, you have like people who are like hearers. They hear it and they love to hear it. Then you have people that are doers. They don't hear anything, they just do. Then you have people who are like who do. they are what they do.
Mhm.
Don't you see what I'm doing? And then finally, you had the people that are they hear the word of God and they do it. And he says they're blessed in all they do. So you got people that are, you can put them in kind of like 4 different categories. And in regards to people that gather together as the church, right? You have some people, and the word of God talks about this, who love hearing the word of God. I mean, they just love it, and they'll come on Sunday and they'll hear the message, right? And they'll go, oh my goodness. I've never heard a message. That was so good. Then I'm going to come back again next week, John, and I'm going to hear another one, right? And they love hearing it so much. It's like, you know what? I hear there's a conference coming to town. And you can hear like 3 days worth of good stuff, right?
That's right.
And so the person says, hear, hear, because they're hearers. They don't only hear now, but they're so encouraged. Matter of fact, they may stay with you for 20 years hearing what you have to say, complimenting you, evaluating you, giving you report cards, what's going on, telling you repeated yourself, right? And they're hearers of the word, but they're not doers of the word. They're here. So you have to understand there's a big difference between a hearer and a doer. Jesus, the word of God says, they flattered me with their lips, but their hearts were far from me, right? And then you have the other folks. I was talking to somebody one time, and they were talking about, I don't have any time to read the word. I'm just so busy, and I don't have time to really go to church, but, I love God. I just like doing for him. I'm just a doer. I'm a doer. I just like doing. And so I do this good work, and I do that good work, and if there's something going on, I go do this and go do that, and, I'm just a doer. As a matter of fact, you have a lot of doers that come together for pancake breakfasts and stuff, and they go, hey, how are you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine. What are you doing? Oh, I'm doing this. Oh, you are? Well, I'm doing this. Then there's kind of competitions like, well, I'm doing this. And somebody else says, well, I'm doing that. And I'm doing more than you. It's like whoever has the biggest pile of do feels like they have the biggest pile of value, right? I call that the do-do meetings. And so then you have the hoodoo. Now, there's a lot of hoodoo going on too. No, hoodoo, not voodoo, but hoodoo. Hoodoo is what we find out in Matthew chapter 7 when Jesus talks about that you can actually move in gifts. You can sing, you can dance in the Holy Ghost.
Oh, yeah.
You can preach. You can effectively use the name and the authority of Jesus Christ, and people can be delivered, and you can prophesy. I mean, Jesus says this. And so, that's what you're doing. But then Jesus says, but I never knew you. But they don't care about that. These folks are like, listen, you need to book me. You need to book me because, I'm an evangelist and it's an evangelist. And I love it. I'm not saying anything against evangelists, but we're just talking about the hoodoos that they just, they can't settle too long, because they settle too long, you're going to find out, who they are by their fruit. What I do is I think about Jim Baker. Jim Baker wrote a book, and in this particular book, he wrote it. In this book, he entitled it, what was it? I was wrong. And what he did was he thought hoodoo, because he would see people come and minister in gifts and prophesy and miracles would happen, but then he'd go have dinner with them, and they were mean and hateful, and they just wouldn't line up with, but he just figured God doesn't have an issue with it. That's why his book's entitled I was wrong. And so, but hoodoo's a big thing, because if you can play an instrument, they will actually put you on a stage and hire you. And somebody told me that one of the most important things in the church is people that involved in doing hoodoo things. Right? And I'm like, oh, well, why don't people just do it? Type thing. And so, music's a pretty powerful industry. Ask, Star Search, American Idol, X Factors, and all those different things. They're looking for, we will, if you can do that, man, we got some hoodoo going on. We can make some money on you. And there's no difference in that if we do that in God's folks. One particular person, they, said they in ministry, and they actually were facing a lot of debt that was in front of them. So what they did was, this they openly said it. They just went and said, I went and booked a lot of speaking engagements as an evangelist to pay off my debt. I'm like, you're telling me there's a good thing? Right. You just went to you went to all these different congregations that were pastored by these churches These pastors, they were pastored by these churches and took their resources to pay your debt off because you got a who on you, or you got some do on you. You know what I'm saying? And that's like a hoodoo, you know. And that's a big deal because, you know, when you look at Paul was dealing with the Corinthian church, I believe, about, you know, they were tied up in like who can do this and who can do that, and he's like, listen, all these things are submitted to God. Every one of them are subject to the prophet. You know, that it's not about that. And then finally, you have the here-do. And this is what God's looking for. And this is what Pastor Jackson was talking about when he was talking about in the interview, Bishop Harry Jackson, when he was talking about, you know, that we got to mobilize. We got to do something about this. And think about this. Isn't it unjust if somebody's telling you you don't have to do what you're hearing, but God's going to say to you, away from me, I never knew you. He says, whatever I entrusted to you, you're going to have to do something with that, and you did nothing with it. You're not saved by works, but works is a byproduct of the very fact that you exist and love God. For example, you say you love your wife. Well, you come home sometimes. You know what I'm saying? I just, you know, and think about it. It's just something you do because you're married. There's something that you do. When you're a believer, you actually means you believe what he says, and you are his disciple. You follow his teachings. Following his teachings does not save you, but if you are saved, guess what you strive to do in view of his grace and his mercy? Follow his teachings.
Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFN TV.
You know, a lot of people want to abide with the Lord, but they just don't have a plan to do it. You can request that plan today at iabide.org.
I'm your host, Greg Lancaster, and we're so glad that you've joined us. Don't forget you can join us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Download our app and sign up for our newsletter, The Torch, at vfntv.com. I've enjoyed our time together. God bless.